The room was packed with pilots from squadrons across the base, flight suits lined with mission patches, coffee cups in hand. Everyone was buzzing with energy for the biggest NATO refueling exercise in 5 years. Captain Julia Hart sat in the second row from the back, quiet as always, her notepad open and her pen ready. Colonel Briggs walked to the front of the room. His voice sliced through the chatter like a knife. He named each aircraft assignment with precision, tossing the lead role to Captain Jake Maverick, the golden boy of the squadron, with the charm and swagger to match his call sign. Maverick stood like he was on a stage, throwing out a confident salute and a loud, cheeky response that drew chuckles from the younger pilots. Julia didn't smile. She had already memorized the flight path, studied the pressure zones, and triple-checked the emergency protocols. This wasn't her first rodeo, but it felt like she'd been left in the stands once again. When Briggs got to her name, he paused just long enough to make it feel intentional. Backup support. Non-essential loiter pattern. No primary lane assignments unless instructed. The words landed hard. Julia didn't flinch. Her pen kept moving. A murmur rose from the front of the room. Someone said something just loud enough to carry. Babysitting duty. She didn't look up. She didn't need to see who said it. She could feel the glances, the smirks, the quiet pity from those who knew she deserved more but wouldn't say it out loud. Maverick turned toward her as the room emptied. "Hey, steady Hart, you ready to orbit and watch the big boys fly?" His voice wasn't cruel. It was worse. Casual, dismissive, like she was part of the furniture. She stood slowly, collected her notes, and walked past him without a word. Her face was calm, but inside her mind was already rehearsing procedures. If anything went wrong, she knew she'd be called. They always called her when things got tight. Outside, the sun hit the tarmac hard. Rows of jets lined up like soldiers waiting to march. Her plane was at the far end, away from the prime positions, the quiet section, the forgotten corner. But she liked it there. No crowd, no noise, just her and the aircraft. That's where she belonged, in the place people forgot until they needed saving. Part 1. The Quiet Strength. Captain Julia Hart had always believed that flying wasn't about being seen. It was about knowing your aircraft better than anyone, trusting your instincts, and staying calm when others couldn't. She carried herself with quiet certainty, never loud, never showy, just steady. She joined the Air Force straight out of a small town in Idaho, where the biggest crowd she'd ever spoken to was her high school math class. No one had expected much from her, but while others chased attention, Julia chased skill. She stayed late in the simulator. She took every night shift, every bad weather mission, every opportunity to learn. By the time she turned 32, she had more flight hours in tankers than most of her squadron combined. She'd flown across oceans, through sandstorms, and in war zones, always without incident. Her record was spotless, but her name rarely made it to the top of any assignment board. Other pilots wore their uniforms crisp and pristine. Julia's looked lived in. Her boots were scuffed. Her name tag faded. She didn't care. To her, every mark was a reminder of something real. A mission flown. A crew brought home. People liked her, but they didn't notice her. She didn't speak up in meetings unless it mattered. She didn't go drinking after hours or laugh the loudest in the officers' club. She spent her time studying cloud layers, adjusting muscle memory, checking fuel ratios, and running through failures in her head just to be sure. That morning's briefing had felt like all the others. Loud voices, confident hands waving in the air. Julia sat with her pen poised, ready for a job that required more than bravado. When her name was called last tagged to the backup role, she didn't react. She had expected it. Non-essential. The word had a sting. Not because it was unfair, but because it told her what leadership valued. She wasn't political. She didn't perform. She just delivered. And in places where politics ran faster than facts, that wasn't enough. As the others filtered out of the room, Julia stayed seated a moment longer. She looked down at her notes, perfectly ordered and full of numbers no one else had bothered to calculate. Then she stood and folded the pages away. Outside, the Nevada heat shimmered off the runway. Her KC-135 sat at the far end, patient and ready. She walked toward it with a quiet focus. There would be no cameras, no cheers. No one would remember what she was doing today, unless something went wrong. And that, she knew, was why she prepared. Because when the noise faded and the real work began, someone needed to be steady. Someone needed to already be ready. Part 2. The Culture of Flash. The officers' club was already buzzing when Julia pushed open the door. The smell of burnt coffee and polished wood filled the space along with the sound of laughter coming from the largest table in the room. She walked in quietly, hoping to grab a quick cup and head back to her quarters, but the noise made her pause. Jake Maverick held court at the center of it all, gesturing like a showman mid-performance. He was telling a story about pulling G's during a training mission in Germany, complete with accents and sound effects. The crowd around him, mostly junior pilots, hung on every word. Julia recognized most of the faces. Some had just finished simulator rotations, others were on the roster for tomorrow's mission. They looked relaxed, confident, like they belonged there. She walked past them toward the far side of the room where the coffee sat in a dented metal urn. As she poured her cup, Jake spotted her. His voice didn't rise, but the room quieted a little, sensing a shift. He called out with a grin, "Steady Hart, gearing up for your big day in the loiter lane." There was some laughter light at first. Julia turned slowly, cup in hand, her face calm. "Just reviewing the same mission you are," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." Jake leaned back in his chair. "Right. But I imagine your version of the mission is a little less intense. What's your call sign again, standby?" The room tilted toward him, waiting. One or two uncomfortable chuckles escaped. Julia didn't flinch. "My call sign is steady," she said. "And I earned it." Jake smiled, not unkindly. "Steady fits, careful, deliberate, useful in theory. But tomorrow's all about speed. Split-second calls, flying like your life depends on it." Julia took a slow sip of her coffee. Then she said, "Quiet and firm speed without precision is just noise. Precision without speed is still control. They're not opposites. They're partners." The silence was sharper now. A few faces in the crowd shifted. Jake's grin wavered just a little. Julia didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked out of the club, leaving behind the smell of coffee, the sound of nervous laughter, and the weight of eyes watching her go. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been all day. The sun was dropping behind the hangars, painting the sky a dusty orange. Julia walked alone toward her quarters. She didn't feel embarrassed. She felt certain. Inside her head, the mission ran again. Wind direction, fuel consumption, emergency handoffs. She had already run it 100 times. Let them talk. Let them joke. Tomorrow would sort it all out. Part 3. The Invisible Expert. Julia sat on the edge of her bunk that evening, the briefing notes folded neatly on her lap. The walls of her room were bare save for a single photo taped near the mirror. Her at 22, standing beside her first assigned KC-135, beaming with the kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken. That had been the day she'd made her first solo flight across the Atlantic. Back then, she thought hard work would always be enough. She hadn't expected politics, hadn't understood how often louder voices would outpace steadier hands. The first time she was passed over, it stung. The second time, it confused her. By the third, she had stopped asking why. She'd learned to work in the quiet, to build her confidence in numbers and procedures and checklists memorized until they lived in her bones. Her calm didn't come from ego. It came from knowing that when things fell apart, she would not. Sometimes she thought about that night in Kandahar when a hydraulic line failed mid-flight. The crew had panicked, the controls felt like bricks. She'd stayed silent through the chaos, made 3 quiet corrections, and brought the bird home without a scratch. No one wrote about that in the monthly report. She never liked attention. Not because she was shy, but because it rarely came for the right reasons. Her father once told her, "If you want applause, go into theater. If you want respect, do your job better than anyone else, and keep doing it when no one's watching." Outside, the hangars glowed under floodlights. She made her way across the tarmac toward her aircraft, passing rows of parked jets that looked almost peaceful in the dark. Her tanker waited at the far end, its surface catching the last gold light from the west. As she neared it, she saw Chief Carter under the wing, flashlight in hand. He didn't look up when she approached. He was running his hand along the boom, checking for microfractures like it was sacred work. "Evening, Captain," he said without turning. "Just wanted to give your bird one last once-over. Controls feel smoother than any tanker I've checked this month." Julia stood beside him and watched. "Any issues?" she asked. Carter shook his head. "Opposite. That boom is so clean it could thread a needle at 30,000 feet. He straightened and wiped his hands. Been around long enough to know who's real and who's noise. You're the one I want flying my kids if it ever came to that." The words sat heavy in the air, not because they were dramatic, but because they were rare. He wasn't flattering her. He was stating a fact. Julia nodded once quietly. "Thanks, Chief." He stepped back, gave her a nod, and walked off into the fading light. She turned toward the ladder and climbed into the cockpit, the controls familiar under her fingers. One more checklist, one more review, because she didn't know if anyone else would be ready. But she would. That had always been enough. Part 4. The Storm Breaks Protocol. Sub. Part 4.1. Mission begins. The base was still quiet when Julia stepped into the operations center just after 4. She carried a thermos in one hand and a tablet in the other, her boots silent on the polished floor. The air felt heavy, like it knew something the briefings hadn't covered. She moved straight to the weather display, eyes locking on the swirling mass over the North Atlantic. The storm had grown overnight faster and stronger than predicted. Wind speeds had doubled. Visibility dropped below a mile across most of the corridor. Colonel Briggs stood near the screens, dark circles under his eyes. He'd been there all night. Julia approached without hesitation, pointing to the newest satellite data. Gusts over 60. She kept her voice calm. "These aren't training parameters anymore." He studied the numbers for a beat, jaw tight. "We're not delaying," he said. "Command is watching. NATO observers, congressional attention. The window's tight and it's now or never." She didn't argue. She didn't try to convince him. But as she walked out into the hallway, her shoulders felt heavier than usual. She'd seen crews freeze up in far less. By 6, the squadron assembled for final briefing. The room was quieter than the day before. Fewer jokes, more eyes flicking toward the screens. Even Maverick wasn't smiling as wide. The swagger had dulled. When the meteorologist stepped up, the room fell into a thick silence. Satellite images showed red spirals covering the corridor. She didn't sugarcoat it. Today's weather would test every limit they knew. Julia sat near the back, absorbing each forecast. She had already memorized most of it, but hearing it aloud made it feel more real, more immediate. She could feel the nerves ripple across the room. The briefing ended. Assignments held. Julia stayed in the backup column. She folded her notes neatly, slid them into her flight jacket, and stood. No one said much as they filtered out to pre-flight. Outside, the wind had picked up. She walked past clusters of crews doing checks, listening to bits of nervous chatter. Some talked fast. Others stayed silent. Everyone could feel it. This mission wasn't going to go as planned. She reached her aircraft and paused at the base of the ladder. Her crew was already on board. Systems were running, fuel lines secured, everything in place. She took one last look at the sky. The clouds were boiling. This wasn't routine anymore. This was when training ended and instinct began. Subpart 4.2, Primary Crew Fails. The sky over the North Atlantic looked like war. Clouds tore across the horizon in thick layers, wind gusting so hard it rattled control panels. Julia held steady at 70 miles southeast, her tanker gliding just outside the chaos. Radio chatter filled her headset, sharp and clipped. Maverick's voice came in tight, trying to hold formation with the first group of fighters. They were fighting the wind, visibility close to zero, aircraft bouncing like toys. One of the Raptors called in turbulence, hitting too hard to maintain position. Another reported ice buildup on the wing. Maverick responded, but his tone had changed. The confidence was thinning. Julia adjusted her instruments, watching the data shift minute by minute. Suddenly, the calm snapped. One of the F-22s broke off, reporting flutter in the controls. Seconds later, Maverick's voice cracked with panic. Boom, control failure. The refueling system had locked up. Julia's eyes jumped to her radar. The formation was scattering. 2 Raptors turned toward Greenland with critical fuel states. The rest wobbled in an unsteady orbit, burning more fuel with every second. Command ordered the mission to continue. Julia felt it in her chest. This wasn't a delay. It was collapse. She keyed her mic to speak, was cut off. Maintain radio silence unless addressed. She didn't argue. She switched to tactical and listened. The voices were raw, tense pilots doing everything to stay airborne. Maverick was losing them. Not because he didn't care, because he wasn't ready. One Raptor called out last minutes of fuel. Another was drifting out of position. Julia glanced at her own gauges. Everything was in the green. Her boom was clean. Her crew was steady. She looked out the window toward the storm line. Her hands moved to the controls before her mind finished the sentence. If she waited for permission, they'd be out of fuel. She keyed the mic again, this time calm and clear. "This is backup, Charlie. I'm moving to primary corridor. I have full boom control and visual on all 4 Raptors." There was a pause, then silence, then finally a response. "Cleared for attempt. God help us all." Julia adjusted heading and banked into the storm. Her crew stayed focused. The plane responded like it always did. Solid. Ready. She passed the outer edge of the weather and watched her radar light up. The Raptors were waiting. And now, they weren't alone. Part 5. Mastery in the Storm. Subpart 5.1. The First Save. Julia's tanker cut through the storm wall like a ghost sensor's blinking red wind screaming past the fuselage. The KC-135 rocked under the force, but she kept her grip steady. Her voice was calm as she radioed the nearest Raptor for approach. The fighter emerged from the gray mist, battered and low on fuel, barely holding position. It trembled in the air, twitching with every gust, the pilot's voice tight with urgency. Julia glanced at the numbers. 5 minutes, maybe less, before that jet would be forced to bail. She adjusted her altitude by 200 feet, throttle down by a breath. Her eyes never left the horizon. Behind her, the boom operator lined up, his voice quiet, clipped, watching the dance unfold inch by inch. The first contact attempt failed. The Raptor dipped too low. Julia eased her tanker up again, catching the rhythm of the wind. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just moved tiny corrections that most pilots wouldn't even think to make. A second pass. This time the boom locked in. The signal tone chimed through the headset, fuel flowing. The tanker shook as the wind clawed at them. Julia's hands worked the yoke left then right, holding the pocket of air steady. Sweat ran down her neck. The fighter behind her bounced once, then twice, then held. Her crew said nothing. They didn't need to. 12 minutes passed like 12 hours. When the Raptor finally pulled off, the pilot's voice cracked with relief. Julia didn't respond. She was already scanning for the next jet. She wiped her palm on her flight suit, reset the system, and called out, "Next one up. Let's move." The storm didn't let up, but neither did she. Part 5.2. The New Method. The second Raptor came in sideways, its wings rocking violently in the wind. The pilot was fighting the storm and losing. Julia could hear the strain in his voice, clipped and rushed, the kind of panic that built just before a mistake. She knew the standard procedure wouldn't work. The turbulence was tossing the fighter out of alignment faster than it could correct. There wasn't time for another missed attempt. She called back to her boom operator, told him to brace. Then she eased the nose of her tanker into a shallow descent, adjusted throttle, just enough to let gravity smooth out the airflow behind them. It was a move she'd tested once before during a dusty drop in Afghanistan. Not in the manual. But it worked. The plane responded slowly at first, then settled. A small pocket of stillness formed in the storm, just big enough for the fighter to slide into position. The pilot's breathing slowed in her headset. He called visual. Julia held the pocket steady, with every muscle focused, every sense alert. The boom operator guided the probe home. Contact. Fuel started to flow. For a moment, everything felt quiet, even though the storm raged on outside. Julia watched the gauges, monitored wind shear, and made dozens of micro-adjustments without speaking. Her plane felt like an extension of her body. She moved before the wind hit. She compensated before the readings caught up. When the refueling finished, the fighter peeled away clean. The pilot didn't say much. He didn't have to. Everyone on that channel knew what they had just seen. In the control tower, someone whispered it out loud. She just made her own procedure. Julia didn't hear it. She was already setting up for the next one. The sky hadn't broken yet. Neither had she. Part 6. The Quiet Triumph. Part 6.1. Landing in Glory. The storm hadn't followed her all the way back, but the wind still snapped at the tail as Julia brought the tanker in. Her hand stayed steady on the yoke, adjusting just once as the runway came into view. The wheels touched down smooth and sure, the aircraft settling like it had never been in danger. As she taxied toward the ramp, she saw the line of figures forming. Dozens of uniforms, all standing in formation, watching her roll in. Mechanics, officers, pilots. People who had barely nodded to her yesterday now stood shoulder to shoulder. She powered down the engines and stepped out onto the ladder. The air hit her face sharp and dry. At the bottom stood Colonel Briggs' hat tucked under one arm, face unreadable. He looked up at her, then said it plainly. "I owe you an apology, loud enough for everyone to hear. No excuses, no speeches, just truth." Julia nodded. No need to answer. Around them, the silence was thicker than any applause. She could feel the shift in the way people looked at her. Not just respect, recognition. Maverick stood at the back of the crowd, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. The pilots she had refueled began stepping forward one by one. They didn't salute. They reached out their hands. One pilot, still pale from the flight, told her quietly, "My daughter gets to see her mom tonight." That was all. Julia kept her eyes steady, her voice low when she spoke. "We did our jobs. That's what matters." Then she walked back toward the hangar, her steps unhurried. She didn't need the crowd to know who she was, but today finally they did. Part 6.2, The Investigation. The conference room felt colder than the air outside. Julia sat across from 3 officers, their uniforms crisp, their eyes sharp. This was not punishment, but it was still pressure. They asked her to walk through the timeline, from the first briefing to her decision to enter the corridor. She answered clearly, without hesitation. She didn't blame. She didn't excuse. When they asked why she broke protocol, she told them the truth. Because there wasn't time to wait. Because she knew the conditions better than anyone. Because hesitation would have cost lives. One officer asked if the primary crews had failed. Julia shook her head. They were trained for the expected. This storm went beyond that. The real failure was not in the pilots, but in how they had been prepared. She recommended changes, not to shame anyone, but to improve the system. More hands-on weather training, more cross-training on emergency handoffs, regular drills, not just checklists. They listened. One of them scribbled notes while nodding. Another leaned back, quiet and still. At the end, the senior officer closed the file and looked up. "Would you consider leading development of a new training protocol?" She paused, not out of doubt, but weight. It would mean more responsibility, a louder role, one she hadn't chased. But she said yes. Not for the title, but for the chance to make sure next time more crews would be ready. As she left the room, the sun cut through the hallway window, bright against the walls. She walked into it without looking back. 6 months later, the training hangar buzzed with voices in 6 different accents. Pilots from across NATO had come to Halverson for one reason: to learn how to fly through storms with the steadiness of a woman who had once saved an entire formation in the worst conditions imaginable. Julia stood at the front of the briefing room, sleeves rolled up, coffee cooling on the table beside her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room leaned in, not out of formality, but because they wanted to know what she knew. She began with the simple truth. "Procedures will carry you far," she said. "But when the sky throws something new at you, what matters is what you've practiced when no one's watching." The lesson was never about being bold. It was about being prepared. Her methods were quiet but rigorous. She rewrote simulator drills. She led flights into real turbulence with safety layers in place. She quizzed her teams not with trick questions, but with choices that required judgment. Pilots started staying late. Mechanics sat in on her debriefs. Younger instructors watched how she moved around the aircraft, how she handled crew dynamics, how she never looked for credit but always gave it. One afternoon, during a session on emergency sequencing, a new trainee raised her hand. Her voice was uncertain. "How do you prepare for something you've never seen before?" Julia nodded slowly, then looked at the class. "You start with the basics. You build trust with your crew. You learn the patterns, so when something breaks the pattern, your gut knows first. You don't wait for chaos. You assume it's coming and get calm before it arrives." The room was silent, not stiff, just quiet with respect. That kind of clarity only came from someone who had lived it. After the session, Julia walked the flight line alone. Her old KC-135 sat parked just beyond the shade of the hangar now used exclusively for training. Someone had painted a phrase near the crew door: "Steady as she goes." In her office, she opened a leather-bound logbook. The pages were clean, untouched. A gift from the 4 pilots she had refueled that day in the storm. Inside the cover, they had written a note in simple blue ink: "For every life you help save from now on." She sat down and wrote on the first page: Day 1, Major Julia Hart, Senior Instructor, Mission: prepare the ones who come next. Status always ready. She closed the book, set it down and looked toward the window. Outside, engines hummed in the distance as another class took off for drills. Julia smiled not because she had been proven right, but because now she could help others be ready before the test arrived. That she thought was more than enough.